If you're getting started with shooting a color grading drone video, or footage from any camera for that matter, there's a good chance you heard about shooting in D-LOG. Maybe you're like, great, but what on earth is D-LOG? And do you know how to expose and color grade log? Well, let me answer these 4 questions about D-LOG for you. What is D-LOG? Why should I even shoot in D-LOG? How do I expose for D-LOG? How do I color grade D-LOG? Maybe you're not shooting with a DJI drone, but another camera that records in C-Log, S-Log, V-Log, F-Log. And those manufacturers will have instructions on how to expose for their cameras specifically, and you should definitely look into that. But everything else I'll show you here will apply to those log formats as well. I'm here to show you the workflow when you shoot in log. What is D-LOG? Log is all about preserving dynamic range. The dynamic range is the distance between the brightest highlights and the darkest shadows your camera can capture without clipping out details. So if your scene has a wider dynamic range than your sensor can capture, you'll have to either expose for the shadows or the highlights, and you'll then lose information in the other end of the dynamic range. That's why a camera's dynamic range is important, but you need to preserve all that dynamic range in a container, and that's what you do when you shoot in RAW. Most cameras can shoot photos in RAW, but only the most professional ones can shoot video in RAW, and the file sizes are very big. So to compromise between massive file sizes and keeping the container big enough to hold the dynamic range, camera manufacturers have developed a way to squeeze the large range into a smaller container by using math with a logarithmic scale, which is a way of displaying numerical data over a wide range of values in a compact way. That way you get the most amount of data in the smallest space possible, and you get to keep a lot more details in the highlights and in the shadows. But that also means that your image now has much less contrast and looks really flat and desaturated, and we need to know how to color grade it to expand it back to make it look good again. And how you do that, that's what I'll show you in the last part of this video. Why shoot in D-LOG? We shoot in log to preserve as much information as possible, even if we don't necessarily grade to keep all the highlights and shadows. We still have the option to bring out the details in those areas. If you shoot in normal mode, the camera decides what to remove and what to keep for you. So shoot log if your scene has a wider dynamic range than what you can capture in normal mode. A typical example of this is when you shoot against the sun and have a foreground in shadow where you want to be able to see or bring out details. Or if you're shooting in a place where the light changes a lot, like when clouds keep coming and going in front of the sun. Or if you need to color match clips from multiple scenes or cameras and you're comfortable with a color grading workflow, shooting in log can make your work so much easier, as everything will be in the same color space to begin with. And if you want the most possible control over your footage and don't want the camera to decide which parts gets clipped. Now, you don't necessarily need to shoot log if you have a scene with limited dynamic range and you can control the lighting. For example, if you're shooting indoors in a studio, or if you need to deliver the footage shortly after shooting. So if you shoot something that needs to go out on social media very quickly, then you don't maybe want the color grading process in between, and you would probably be better off just shooting in normal mode. How to expose for D-LOG. So while I'm showing off how to expose for D-LOG here, the procedure will be very similar to other types of log, but you should definitely check out your camera manufacturer's guidelines. So obviously be sure to actually have set your camera to log mode, and now you'll have a flat and bad looking image on your remote. But luckily DJI has a color display assist option that will let you see a normalized image on the monitor. For D-LOG, you can look up DJI's white paper and see that they recommend that you expose middle gray at 41% and other highly technical information. But if you skip that and talk in plain language, in general it's a good idea to expose D-LOG to the right, meaning that you should rather expose to preserve highlights than shadows, as D-LOG can be very noisy if it's underexposed. Unfortunately, we have some tools to help us when exposing. So apart from the color display assist option, you'll benefit from looking at the histogram, which will tell you if you're crushing shadows or highlights. So in order to expose to the right, use the histogram to dial in your exposure so that the histogram is pushed as far to the right as possible without clipping the highlights. This will give you cleaner highlights and remove as much noise as possible in your shadows, making sure you have the best starting point before you start color grading. And the last tool you can use to avoid clipping highlights is the overexposure warning, or more commonly known as zebras. This will very clearly show you if you are overexposed and where the overexposure is happening in the image. Just be aware that if you're shooting a dark subject in the foreground and you have a bright sky or sun in the background, you might not want to expose to keep the background from clipping, as this will leave you without details where it matters on your subject in the foreground. So sometimes you'll have to compromise, and that's where your creative intent comes into play. So knowing these three tools, expose to the right, the histogram and zebras, and how to use them to get the best possible exposure will help you get the best results. And pro tip here. On top of this, remember that shooting at the lowest possible ISO will help keep your image clean. So before you increase your ISO to a higher level, try to see if you can use your shutter, your aperture, or maybe add some lights first. How to grade D-Log. In order to get log footage to look good, you first need to normalize it, meaning bringing it from its log state into a Rec 709 state. To do that, you should use a LUT designed specifically for that. It's referred to as a technical conversion LUT, and it's all just math. It tells your color grading tool exactly what the log footage values should be converted to bring it into Rec 709. Now you could do this manually, but just be aware that you cannot do that quickly, and most certainly not as precisely as a specifically designed LUT. All manufacturers provide this type of LUT, so just go check out their website if you don't have one for your camera already. But let's jump into DaVinci Resolve and grade us some D-Log. Okay, so here we are in DaVinci Resolve, and I have a clip here. This is the bridge between Denmark and Sweden. This is recorded in D-Log. This is actually an H.265 clip, but the color space is D-Log, so it's looking flat and kind of boring. So you have a couple of ways to get this from a boring D-Log state into Rec 709. The first one is if you go down to your cogwheel down here in the bottom right hand corner, if you go to your color management under color science, if you have chosen DaVinci Hawaii RGB, you are in a non-color managed workflow, and you're basically telling DaVinci, don't do anything, I've got this, I know how to grade this. The other way is let DaVinci do the color management and bring anything that is in log out to Rec 709. And what you do is, if you look at the image now, if I click save, you can see everything is now handled by DaVinci. You can add your nodes here, and you can do your exposures and your grades and whatever. And DaVinci will figure out how to put that into the workflow and make it look nice. That's easy, that's super fast, that's convenient, but you don't have that much control over it. So there's another way to do that. So if you go back to the project manager and you switch back to DaVinci YRGB, so now you have a non-color managed, boring looking image, you could add a technical conversion LUT like we talked about. So let me just rename this node to LUT. We go into the LUTs, and DJI has a Mavic 3D log to Rec 709. So if you apply that LUT to your image, the same thing will happen. But now you have that in your pipeline, and now you know everything that happens from here and down the pipeline or up the pipeline will be in a linear state in Rec 709, and everything you have before will be working in a log state in a log mode with more details, a bigger color space. So that also means your tools will behave a little bit different. So if you add a node after and a node before, so this is a node working in log state. Let's call this exposure. And if you take a look at the scopes down here, if I increase, now I'm going a little crazy here with the gain, going to go way overboard. But if you take a look at how the scopes react, everything gets pushed up, but the top part gets pushed and squeezed a little bit more, but you're actually also pushing the bottom part of the image. Let me reset that and go over to the exposure node after the LUT. Now if I increase the gain, see, I'm not touching the bottom half as much, and I get these spikes very early. So now I'm actually clipping up here. Everything here is clipped. If I reset that and go back to the exposure again, see how I move everything up. This is because we're working in a logarithmic state, so I'm not even clipping now. Everything is just pushed a lot. And if I reset that node again, so if I go back to the Rec 709, I clip the information here, and then I go back to the log state, I can bring it back. But we now change the scopes. So you don't want to do your exposure controls after a LUT. You don't want to do that in a Rec 709 state. You want to do that over here in the log state. So this is where you would add your exposure nodes, your balance nodes, and if you have a contrast, oh sorry, let me rename that, balance node, add a new node and call that contrast. And your tools here will be color space aware, meaning that your HDR tools, if you add an exposure compensation here of 0.5, that means you bring up the whole image half a stop, like your camera would do half a stop, because your tools is color space aware and you're working in a log space. So let me just reset that. So this is the way you can control it with a conversion LUT. Another way to control it, let me reset these and let me just delete these, is to add a color space transform. So if you go into your effects, you will have a color space transformation. Let me just get this. Here you have it. And then you have to set your input. We're shooting in D-LOG and we want to output for Rec 709, Rec 709, and we want to find gamma 2.4. And we can lose that. So this is a color space transformation. It's another way of doing it. This is Da Vinci's math for transforming the color space. The principle is the same. You can do everything you do before here is in a log state, and everything you do after this node is in a Rec 709 state. Which is better, the CST or the LUT? Well, it kind of depends on how good the LUT is from the manufacturer. And I would say there's very little difference. The good thing about the color space transform here is you have more controls over how the transformation is happening. So if something is a bit off, you can tweak your settings here. And after that, you can grade your look. So this is just the 4 different versions I made of the grade from log footage. If I go to full screen here, you can see you can go very different ways with your grades, all depending on what you want and what you need to deliver. But the power of log is that you have a lot more information than you have in Rec 709. So you have a lot more things you can do before the image falls apart. So I hope you liked everything here about color management, and this gave you some useful information. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to leave a comment. If you like the channel, please hit the like button, subscribe, and give us some love. And if you have any questions, just let us know and I will be happy to answer. Happy grading!